our Caribbean consciousness in the establishment of a Caribbean community known as CARICOM. So, we pay tribute here to the 4 founding fathers of CARICOM, the leaders of those 4 great nations, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, Guyana, and Barbados. And those 4 great men, Dr. Eric Williams of Trinidad and Tobago, Michael Manley of Jamaica, Forbes Burnham of Guyana, and Errol Barrow of Barbados, are 4 great pillars of strength who came together on July 4th, 1973 to sign the Treaty of Chaguaramas to launch CARICOM as a political reality. But these men had their own struggles individually, and each of them were fought for their social consciousness for the masses of the black peoples in their separate countries. So let's take a very quick crash course in these 4 pioneers of Caribbean unity, starting with Dr. Eric Williams, the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, who remains and is considered to be the father of the nation politically of Trinidad and Tobago. Born on September 25th, 1911, passed away on March 29th, 1981. Great scholar, was in office as premier, first premier of Trinidad and Tobago from 1956, then from independence in 1962, all the way up to when he died in office in 1981. Now, there is a United States government file that was released by WikiLeaks just a few years ago. This file on Dr. Eric Williams is dated July 13th, 1979, and it was declassified and released by Cheryl P. Walter of the United States Department of State on March 20th, 2014. It is referenced under Executive Order GS 198-50713, reference person Rickett Jonathan B. And this document is currently available on the Public Library of the United States Diplomacy website. The title of it is Political Succession in Trinidad and Tobago. This file is a United States document that involved the CIA spying on Dr. Eric Williams as Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago and discussing either replacing him, overthrowing him, having a coup against him, or assassinating him. In reference to Dr. Eric Williams' leadership, this document, which is available for you to research for yourself, said in Section 4, Eric Williams is not, as of July 13th, 1979, about to step down, because they were obsessed with the idea of removing Dr. Eric Williams because of his connections to revolutionary leaders and his closeness to Fidel Castro of Cuba, of course, whom they had military plans against, a destabilization and multiple assassination attempts. So anyone in the Caribbean who they figured was too close or possibly influenced by Fidel Castro and the Cuban revolutionary socialism, they had a plan to remove them. They said of Dr. Eric Williams, he's not about to step down, and while dissatisfaction with his stewardship is widespread, he has no effective challenger. The man is mean, vindictive, and unpredictable, but also highly intelligent, cunning, and by far the best political strategist and manipulator in these parts. Here is Dr. Eric Williams welcoming His Imperial Majesty Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, to Trinidad and Tobago. The United States CIA report continues, as a consequence, he can stay on as Prime Minister as long as he wants, barring only incapacitation or, as always, some other currently unpredictable event or circumstance. End of quote. The United States agency established profiles on other possible candidates within the Trinidad and Tobago political framework and determined which among them they should support if a coup was planned against Dr. Williams. Look at the level of discussion. And there's a whole section of the document that talks about Carl Hudson Phillips as the most respected black man who could be a possible contender to Dr. Errol Williams. They spoke about John Donaldson. They spoke about George Chambers and others whom, if Dr. Williams is overthrown, who could be put to replace him. Because, you see, another problem that they had with Dr. Errol Williams was his what seemed to be an inclination towards socialist policies, especially after the oil boom. So not only was he friends with Fidel Castro of Cuba and Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, but Mao Zedong of China, communist leadership, which terrified the United States of America. So, another part of the document entitled Allegation of Coup Plan, dated November 27, 1978, from out of the office of the Bureau of the Inter-American Affairs, which took note of concern about a brewing revolution in Trinidad and Tobago. They're having all these discussions about violence and revolution and insurrection and overthrow and rebellion in our country, while the people in our country just fit in and live in a cavalier life. This document noted that the November 27, 1978 edition of the Express newspaper was headlined, "Pandey Warns of Coup to Oust Prime Minister," and that other local news broadcasts were featuring the same story. A hint to possible United States involvement is seen where the document says, quote, "Despite the disruption which we predict will follow Williams's departure, we do not perceive conditions suggesting the opening of the door to extremists, for example, pro-Cuban takeover. The successor government, we believe, will be able to maintain internal stability." Because their fear was that if Dr. Errol Williams is either assassinated or removed or overthrown in a coup, they wanted to make sure that the follow-up political leadership was not sympathetic towards Fidel Castro of Cuba or Mao Zedong of China or communist, socialist, revolutionary policies, which is why Maurice Bishop of Grenada, just a year or so after this, frightened them even more. In Capitalism and Slavery, Dr. Errol Williams said, "Negro slavery provided the capital which financed the Industrial Revolution." That statement provided a rationale for reparations for slavery. He said the Industrial Revolution was the basis of the advancement and growth of modern technology, the computer revolution and globalization, which indicates the establishment of futuristic scientific findings. Dr. Williams delivered 3 nationwide broadcasts in the midst of the 1970 Black Power Revolution on May the 3rd, May the 10th, and June 30th, where he emphasized, he said, "Let me make no bones about it. I identify myself fully with Black Power's constructive aspect." And he went on to announce a number of measures to effect within the limits of the Constitution. And on May the 10th, 1970, he did a cabinet reshuffle, removing his only 2 white government ministers at the time, which were John O'Halloran and Gerald Montano. He left Trinidad to go to Africa on February 12, 1964, and returned on May the 1st. He did a full Africa tour, which took him to Senegal, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Ghana, Nigeria, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, the United Arab Emirates, and Algeria. And think, beloved, 2021, September, we have the Africa CARICOM Summit. But I'm here talking about the 4 pioneers of CARICOM, the 4 founding fathers, and their African consciousness, their legacy of looking out for their people and trying to make life better. And so we go on to the next pillar of CARICOM, who was Michael Manley of Jamaica, born 1924, passed away in 1997. And again, one of the greatest leaders in the history of the entire Caribbean. Michael Manley served as Prime Minister of Jamaica, the fourth Prime Minister, from 1972 to 1980, and then again from 1989 to 1992. Manley championed a democratic socialist program, and he has been described as a populist. And according to opinion polls, he remains one of Jamaica's most popular and loved Prime Minister. Under Manley, there were subsidized meals, transportation, and uniforms for school children from disadvantaged backgrounds, together with free education at the primary level, secondary level, and tertiary level. Remember, it wasn't until 2006 that Trinidad and Tobago, through the great Patrick Manning in education, introduced free university education. This was established by Michael Manley in Jamaica in the 1970s. Michael Manley was a friend of the Nation of Islam. Here he is in 1974 with Minister Louis Farrakhan and Muhammad Ali, a Nation of Islam delegation that visited Jamaica, and Minister Farrakhan addressed the National Stadium jam-packed with our people. Also, the brother of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, John Muhammad, was there, as you see him sitting next to Muhammad Ali, in between Muhammad Ali and Minister Farrakhan. This is under Michael Manley in Jamaica, where Minister Farrakhan again was a guest speaker. This is the mid-1970s with Muhammad Ali. Under Michael Manley, special employment programs were also launched together with programs designed to combat illiteracy. Increases in pensions and poor relief were carried out, along with a reform of local government taxation and an increase in youth training. Michael Manley expressed support for African liberation in countries such as Angola, which successfully fought off the apartheid armies of South Africa with Cuban help. However, the United States of America labeled Jamaican support for African liberation under Manley as hostile. Think! African people in an island that was populated by people taken out of Africa, supporting liberation for Africa itself, and America, who participated in the kidnapping of Africans, see that as hostile. The opposite of that should be hostile. But the United States, in labeling this as hostile, they were critical of the Michael Manley government, in particular for their close friendship with Fidel Castro's Cuba. Michael Manley was also a friend of the legendary Bob Marley, reggae pioneer and superstar. And as a matter of fact, this picture here is one of the most historic photographs probably ever taken in the Caribbean. This was at the One Love Peace Concert in 1976 in Jamaica, where Bob Marley was able to bring together on stage Michael Manley and Edward Seaga, both who served as Prime Minister and opposition leader, at a time where violence was so heightened, with a death toll of as much as 800 people killed in political rivalry. And Bob Marley, who many of our brothers and sisters refer to as a prophet, was a key peacemaker. But after he made that peace, he also was targeted. Of course, following this was the assassination attempt on Bob Marley, just like 3 assassination attempts on Michael Manley. Now, think on this. Henry Kissinger, who was the National Security Advisor to Richard Nixon, who drafted the NSSM 200 report, the National Security Study Memorandum. It was President Richard Nixon who, in hiring Henry Kissinger, who had drafted that report, which pointed out that America has only 6% of the world's population, but they use 34% of the mineral resources. So their number one priority must be to reduce the population of third world peoples in Africa and the third world in particular. That man visited Jamaica in 1975 1 year after they drafted that NSSM 200 document. And he warned Michael Manley, Prime Minister of the country, against supporting Angola and Cuba. And when Michael Manley refused to yield to what Henry Kissinger was trying to subtly instruct him to do, the United States, it is reported, increased a supply of weapons to the JLP party under the leadership of Edward Seaga. And this resulted in one of the sharpest upturns in political violence in Jamaica. The Freedom of Information Act shows us that they orchestrated, the CIA, 3 assassination attempts against Michael Manley, and that they also instigated the food riots in Jamaica in 1976. Not too far from that, the assassination attempt on Bob Marley. And all this violence, all this death. They even let an individual, his name was Charles Little Nut Miller, a criminal in America of Jamaican background, let him out of jail to go back to Jamaica to support the campaign of Edward Seaga. Edward Seaga, it is understood in many circles, was an agent for the CIA who became Prime Minister of Jamaica. Just like our beloved sister Eugenia Charles of Dominica and Mr. Adams of Barbados. It's a very sad story, but it's the political choices that individuals make in thinking that that is the best way, but motivated by greed and selfishness and a lack of regard for the masses of the people. But of course, in each of these societies, you speak to those who were around in the early days, and there were those both for and against, because remember, we largely as a brainwashed people in the region would support our former oppressor coming in and interfering with our nations if we think that under him we'll get food and without them we won't have anything to eat. This brings me to the third main pioneer of CARICOM, the great Forbes Burnham of Guyana, born in 1923, passed away in 1985. And Forbes Burnham, honestly, is probably the most vilified Caribbean leader of all. And in Trinidad and Tobago politics, in particular, 20 years ago, in the 90s decade, and the 2000, 2001, 2002 elections, his name was dragged through the mud in attempting to compare him to other politicians here, using his name as an example of what would not be good for Trinidad. Again, any black man, in particular who occupies a seat of being a prime minister in a Caribbean country, who's being so closely monitored in regards to their sympathy for Cuba or even Libya or socialist, communist regimes and governments with a revolutionary kind of ideology. So much pressure is put on them sometimes, so many of them may just yield and play ball. But Forbes Burnham, in his own way, was a great leader of Guyana, in spite of all that is said about him. And when it comes to politics, of course, good and bad can be said about almost anyone who ever wins an election. But I'm focusing on the positive here of the 4 pillars of CARICOM. Forbes Burnham served as Prime Minister from 1964 to 1980. And then as its first executive president of Guyana from 1980 to 1985. He is often regarded as a strong man who embraced his own version of communism. And throughout his presidency, he encouraged Guyanese to produce and export more local goods, especially through the use of state-run corporations and agricultural cooperatives. Forbes Burnham, after attending the 1970 summit of the non-aligned movement in Zambia in Africa, he paid official visits to several African countries. just like what Dr. Eric Williams did 6 years before. Forbes Burnham of Guyana visited Zambia, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia over the period September 12th to the 30th in 1970. And the Guyanese government remained fully involved in the African liberation movement throughout. Burnham sent more than 100 Guyanese public servants to various departments of the Zambian government, just like Trinidad and Tobago had the teacher exchange program under Dr. Eric Williams with Uganda in Africa. And many Guyanese doctors, engineers, lawyers, and secretaries worked in southern African states throughout the 1970s. And Burnham remained president of Guyana until his death. He died on August the 6th, 1985, after undergoing throat surgery in Cuba. Here is Forbes Burnham with Fidel Castro. And that's not a pleasant picture for America. And then I bring us to our final great of the four pioneers of CARICOM, former Prime Minister Errol Barrow of Barbados, born in 1920, died in 1987. Prime Minister Errol Barrow of Barbados was and is a national hero of Barbados. He was part of the British military, just like Trinidad and Tobago's own Uric Cross. Served in the war, then studied, returned to Barbados in 1950 and was elected into the parliament in 1951 as a member of the BLP, the Barbados Labour Party. In April 1955, Errol Barrow and 21 of his colleagues established the DLP, the Democratic Labour Party, as a progressive alternative to the BLP. They entered the election of 55, they did not win. But in December 1961, they won the general election with Barrow as leader. He served as Premier of Barbados from 1961 to 1966, when they became independent. And then, of course, Errol Barrow was the first Prime Minister of Barbados, leading them into independence from England. And he became Prime Minister, where he stayed in that position for 10 years. Until 1976. Errol Barrow was a dedicated proponent of regional integration, spearheading the foundation of CARIFTA. 8 years later, CARIFTA evolved into CARICOM. CARIFTA, of course, is the Caribbean Free Trade Area, where the Treaty of Chaguaramas was enacted to bolster political and economic relations between the English-speaking Caribbean territories. And after another landslide victory in 1971, the DLP returned to the electorate and stayed up to 1976, where he lost. Now, as a strong advocate of Caribbean unity, of Caribbean regional integration, Barrow fiercely opposed interference in Caribbean affairs. And as opposition leader in 1983, he spoke out forcefully with strength against the United States invasion of Grenada. And he launched what was described as scathing criticism of Caribbean leaders who, as he said, were kowtowing to Washington, which included Tom Adams of Barbados, Edward Seaga of Jamaica, and Eugenia Charles of Dominica. And in May 1986, after being 10 years Prime Minister, then 10 years opposition leader, he was returned to office as Prime Minister. And then he won 24 to 27 seats. And in his first press conference as Prime Minister, he referred to President Ronald Reagan of the United States as that cowboy in the White House. And in a British interview, he characterized the President of the United States as a zombie who is programmed. He said he's a very dangerous person with a wicked intention for the Caribbean and Caribbean people. Errol Barrow was defiant in his love for the Caribbean as a region. one of the four great pillars of CARICOM. But a year after his re-election in 1986, he died in office after collapsing on June the 1st, 1987. And by act of parliament in Barbados in 1998, Errol Barrow was named one of the 10 national heroes of Barbados. And each of these individuals, the great Dr. Eric Williams of Trinidad and Tobago, Michael Manley of Jamaica, Forbes Burnham of Guyana, and Errol Barrow of Barbados. These are the four leaders of the Caribbean who signed the Treaty of CARICOM on July the 4th, 1973 in Chaguaramas in Trinidad, the Treaty of Chaguaramas. And here we are, of course, 2021, we had the first Africa CARICOM Summit. Heads of government from African countries in conference with heads of government from Caribbean countries, September the 7th, 2021. And we cannot disconnect this modern day contemporary consciousness with the beginnings of those four pioneers. And also in this conversation about Africa and the Caribbean, in conference, in unity, in summit, and also the grassroots movement, we cannot forget the deeper history of 62 slave rebellions in 21 Caribbean nations between 1522 and 1844. Recently on Knowledge is Power, we did a program highlighting the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution was the most successful, we can say, of the 62 of them. But there were many, many others.